Hello, everyone, and welcome to our third episode of the Students as Stakeholders podcast. I'm your host, Daniel Brogan. Now, did you know the 115th Congress is the most diverse body of elected representatives our country has ever had? According to Pew Research, roughly 1 in 5 members in both the Senate and the House of Representatives identify as non-white. Additionally, just about 20% of both houses identify as female, which is also considered to be the most inclusive session of Congress we have ever had. Now, I would make the claim that we are progressing in truly painting a better depiction of what our society actually looks like through demographic representation, considering that about 39% of the US population identifies as non-white, according to the 2015 census data. I would also like to mention that even though we have 20% of women represented in both houses, that is not reflective of the 50% of the total population that is female in America. Demographic representation is an important factor in a democratic republic because we need to consider as many perspectives as possible to ensure that any legislation being created is good and just law that doesn't unintentionally restrict the rights of others. Now, I remember the first time that I heard of the concept of democratic representation. In my American politics class, the idea was presented to us, and prior to this class, I had never truly considered what the consequences of a lack of demographic representation are for a free society. Though I was aware of the general power structures America has. This was my first college class, and this is when I really began working on the research of student representation. Beforehand, I was a participant, but not actively researching. It was at this time that I considered the necessity of having a full representation of students' concerns. I found that one of the greatest barriers that student representation faces is the concern of marginalized populations and their lack of voice not only in the field of education, but as a whole. Part of my research includes consulting other student groups on potential viable pathways to create the most effective means of empowering student voices. And one of the factors I take most seriously into consideration is when a meeting is being held, who is not in attendance? Why aren't they here? How can we get these students here? Based on my experience, I personally found that a lot of schools that held elections for student advisory councils only advertised them to students that were at student government meetings or were high honor students. I take personal issue with this mindset. Why limit a definition of who can lead based solely on GPA? Why only allow students that have the transportation in place to stay after school? Shouldn't we be reaching out to listen to the thoughtful ideas of at-risk students? When creating educational initiatives, we seem to struggle with engaging the student body, especially those students who are not being provided the tools to succeed. Just to further elucidate this point of disenfranchised students, I want to break down some statistics from PBS and the CDC. Students of color are 3.5 times more likely to be suspended than white students. Additionally, twice as many Black and Latino students will not graduate high school as white students. Now, the most startling statistic I found is that 40% of all expulsions in American schools are Black students. That number alone is alarming, but let's make this statistic more qualitative and more human. According to the National Center for Education Statistics, in 2017, there are roughly 50.4 million students in grades K through 12 in America. Of that number, only about 7.8 million students are Black. That means that Black students make up only 15% of the total student population, despite the fact that nearly half of all students expelled are black. This is such a glaring disparity, and this data also demonstrates that there's some level of profiling happening within our school system, and also that we are committing an incontrovertible disservice to our students of color. But it doesn't end here. Another at-risk population for our schools are the Lgbtqa students, who also face cases of extreme discrimination, bullying, and inadequate support. Based on the data from the Center for Disease Control, students who do not identify as straight are twice as more likely to commit suicide than their straight counterpart. Additionally, 25% of all transgender students have reported attempting suicide at least once in their lifetime. This grave information would be eye-opening to anyone, but it should be absolutely terrifying for policymakers because there is a clear issue with students not feeling safe or supported when they go to school every day. But what about our ELL students? According to EdWeek, the majority of states in America report that students who do not speak English as their primary language graduate at rates of less than 70%. To put this into a better perspective, the national average for students dropping out before graduation is only about 6.5%. That means that English language learners are 5 times more likely to drop out of high school than the national average. At this point, you might be asking, why is this happening? And where are the support mechanisms for these students? I adamantly believe that one of the greatest reasons as to why we have this prolonged disparity between students in our education system is the fact that we aren't engaging these students in conversations about what is working and what is not working for them. They simply do not have a voice that is heard effectively. It is not easy to admit when we are doing something wrong or not well enough, especially considering that we have so many stakeholders genuinely putting in their effort to erase this concerning disparity between our students. I don't inherently believe that these disparities are intentional for the most part, but I do believe that our lack of working with students has stymied our ability to collaborate and make policy that will allow all students to thrive. This is not an easy conversation, and solutions are not always straightforward. But it is with these difficult and even depressing realities we are faced with comes the most amazing opportunities to see our students and our country thrive more than we could have ever believed. Could you imagine how spectacular a society could be if we were able to engage every demographic and keep them motivated in learning? Imagine seeing a graduation rate of 100%, or even seeing expulsion rates plummet to 0. Consider what the level of empowerment and knowledge would do to benefit our society. My goal here for this episode is modest, but extremely powerful. I want to talk about what steps we can take to make students feel like they belong and that their voice absolutely matters. I cannot stress this point enough. No barrier is permanent. We can see all of our students thrive, and we will learn how in today's podcast. So, where should we begin? I think a good starting point is considering the geography of where we hold meetings for students. This may seem benign at first, but consider that any location that is chosen will always have its benefits and its detriments. There is power behind the choice of where we hold meetings, because each choice for a location will either limit or enhance the accessibility for some people to attend and participate. For instance, the Massachusetts State Student Advisory Council holds its regional-based meetings at high schools across the Commonwealth. There are multiple variables involved here when determining the location of these meetings for the Regional Student Advisory Council meetings. What school can and will provide space for a student organization that operates during the school day once every other month or so? More importantly, is the location that is chosen a community that is centralized for the region? In my personal experience, the regional meetings for the Southeastern Regional Student Advisory Council took place in Bridgewater. Now, this is slightly problematic for a few reasons. Without needing to know the geography of Massachusetts, Bridgewater is just about as equidistant to most communities in the region that one could possibly get, which is seemingly beneficial. But is there access to public transportation? The only transportation that can get you to Bridgewater, aside from taking a car, is a commuter rail that does not run frequently enough to guarantee that students could arrive in a timely manner. Plus, this rail is extremely limited in terms of the amount of stations that are offered. This means that no buses run into this town, which extremely limits the accessibility of this meeting space. This means that the only students that could feasibly attend a meeting here are those who have access to a car, essentially. We're now limiting a significant population of students that either do not have a license or their family does not have a car for transportation. Unfortunately, this is the case for many meetings that are held for students because there is oversight in the spaces we choose to congregate and discuss ideas. What would be a better location in this specific instance? We want to look for a town or a community that offers as many viable options as possible for access to public transportation. Regular transit is key in being able to have a more inclusive meeting space. Additionally, if we are trying to create new relations with a school to have a location, it would be best to look for a school that is known for hosting student-based events. If for some reason that is difficult to find, a starting point would be highlighting that the time and frequency of these meetings would be infrequent and held at consistent times, which is not a very serious commitment for schools to have. In the case for Southeastern Massachusetts, I would propose that Plymouth North High School would be the ideal location for the region to ensure that as many people could participate as possible. This is a location that has proximity to a commuter rail, multiple regional bus routes, and some inter-regional bus routes that fully connect the area. The bus stations also connect with a local route that stops directly at the school upon request. If we want these meetings to be inclusive and truly represent the population of our students, this would be the ideal location. Even though this is a specific area, the general considerations can definitely be applied to any state or region that holds these kinds of meetings. Pick a place that offers the most comprehensive public transportation, and pick a time that would allow students to attend. In some instances, local public transportation is free or reduced for high school students, which would ease the concern of the financial burden of attending these meetings. Typically, during the school day is the most ideal time because transportation is limited after school, and traveling could take a few hours between distances, so it is best that if students are attending school the following day, that students can get home at a reasonable time. Schools and educators excuse these absences for students since these are considered academic and productive reasons for not being in class. And again, due to the fact that most of these meetings typically gather once a month or every other month, this doesn't become a concern for students missing too much class time. When we hold meetings where students can't attend, we are indirectly communicating to them that their voice does not matter enough to be able to participate, which can be unbelievably disenfranchising for students. If we are allowing for that mindset to take place, what are the consequences after leaving school? Will these citizens feel helpless or isolated from others? A simple change of location can make the monumental difference of including voices or excluding them permanently. Now, how do we reach out to prospective students being part of these student councils and advisory organizations? Believe it or not, most of the outreach to students, or the lack thereof, is based around the geography of a school. And what I mean by geography here is the idea of the socio-spatial dialectic in our schools, or how places shape the people and how people shape places. How does this transpire in our schools? And how could this possibly relate to representation and marginalization? The administration, faculty, and student groups on campus have a large say in the placement of information within the makeup of a school. Let's say a school wants to have student council sessions after school. So students and an advisor that are interested in such a prospect may advertise in the history wing of the school with flyers, because they believe that people interested in social sciences may be the best fit for being part of a student-led school government. Or another example, maybe a school wants to start up a robotics club, and they advertise this upcoming club in a STEM class or in the math wing. Based on personal experience, when I have observed flyers for after-school activities, there tends to be an absent in 3 areas. The first is that the special needs wing of schools typically have a lot less advertising for after-school clubs than other parts of the school as a whole. Additionally, there's a lack of information for these clubs provided in parts of the school where English language learners are placed, as well as portions of schools that have instructional and or behavioral support classes. These are the most common places for voids of information in our school systems, and it is a result of misconceptions about these types of students. I want to give a personal experience of this inequality in reaching out to students. I've been tutoring refugee students at a few schools in the Burlington area, and at one of the high schools, there is a great program known as Big Picture, or alternative learning that is student-driven, as they have the opportunity to work with mentors out in the real world while still being at school. This program is incredibly personalized and allows students to hone in on their interests in an academic way. I found out about this program from the school website, and I knew the student I was tutoring at the time was incredibly bright and more eager to learn than anyone I have honestly encountered before. I asked the student if they had heard of this program in their school, and their response was, quote, "They don't offer this program for students like me." Let that sink in for a moment. There's an amazing program that very few schools offer nationwide at this school, a program that has proven to be unbelievably successful. Yet, this high school doesn't open this program up for ELL students. What initially struck me by this was the high school's video promoting their program. This high school is one of the most diverse in the state, yet every student in the 3-minute long video was white. My concern was, and still is, that the school may cherry pick the students they want into this program, as opposed to letting students and parents opt into a program that could be life-changing for these students. There's a false conception that people place on ELL students. Since English is not their primary language, the assumption is that they are not as motivated in learning, or they aren't as smart. This could not be any further from the truth, in my opinion. I believe that ELL students are amongst the most intellectual and hardworking students I have ever worked with, because they are learning English on top of having to learn new concepts in a foreign language. Many of these students also act as translators for their parents when they go to the doctors or in public, so they have much more pressure and responsibilities in many instances. These students are very much at risk because of academic and family responsibilities, but yet we almost never reach out to these students to get their feedback on what can work best, at least from a policy level. I think the best way to include these students in an educational conversation would be to work on a school-by-school basis. Find the most common languages spoken, and if a school does participate in sending or electing their students to a student advisory council for state agencies, then they should advertise in multiple languages on flyers, or work with the ELL program coordinator to talk to their students about these kinds of opportunities. We aren't hearing enough from these voices when we're talking about policy, so we need to reevaluate how we interact with these specific stakeholders. One of the core ideas behind representation is the concept of being liaisons or ambassadors. This means that there is an effective communicative pathway between multiple parties. For instance, a company that sees the potential for a group in a foreign economic region wants to send representatives to that region. If we are talking about an effective and good company, their representative will not dictate and impose themselves on this region. Instead, they will collaborate with these foreign partners and accommodate to the needs of the region based on expanding their knowledge of this area. When talking about ed policy and legislation, why don't we offer the same level of dialogue with all of our stakeholders? Some will claim that students aren't as knowledgeable in education, or that they simply don't know what's best for themselves. This is not a productive mindset to have, as we are excluding an entire demographic based on assumption and conjecture, not based on data and evidence. We can and should interact with ELL students when it comes to ed policy, because it allows us to see perspectives we otherwise might be ignorant to. I don't believe one needs to be proficient in a language to convey powerful ideas and discuss thought-provoking issues. Even with a simple base of another language, people can communicate their concerns and what isn't working for them. We do see this at a school-wide level when educators are working with students, but educators are sometimes confined in standards and initiatives that may limit their ability to have these kinds of conversations. A lot of this episode has been problem stating so far, and now I want to focus on viable solutions. For states that do have student advisory councils, or any kind of regional or statewide youth organizations that work with state agencies, the first step is reassessing how we advertise locally. Sometimes the responsibility is of the organization itself to distribute letters of information, but oftentimes the faculty and administration of schools are most responsible for this distribution of information. We need to reach out to our students equally when it comes to giving them a voice in their education. Some state organizations have made a conscious effort to work towards inclusion. In fact, the state of Connecticut has passed a law ensuring that the State Student Advisory Council is demographically representative of the student population. The law reads as, quote, Section 10-2A of the Connecticut General Statutes requires the Commissioner of Education to appoint a State Student Advisory Council on Education and ensure that the membership of this organization includes male and female students, is racially, ethnically, and economically diverse, includes students from each congressional district in the state, and includes students who have disabilities, unquote. This is a fantastic step towards ensuring that we are getting a better, more accurate depiction of our students and their concerns. But the only recommendation that I would have to improve upon this law is that the students should democratically elect their state representatives, as opposed to an appointment. As I have stated in my first episode, Vermont has a law that requires there is one female and one male student representative to the Board of Education. In California, the California Association of Student Councils, who works with the board and the state legislature, have included language in their mission statement to strive for diversity and inclusion. Legislation and policy are great ways of holding accountability for organizations to be truly representative. Another solution, and albeit this one is a lot more difficult, but still viable, is being able to engage and connect students from schools that are underperforming. Many times, with these kinds of student organizations, schools that struggle tend to not be effective in their communication when students and advisors try to reach out. It's tricky to pinpoint why this happens, honestly, but a solution is that an ad hoc committee is created with an existing state advisory council to work on putting full focus to regularly contact these schools. It is the schools that are underperforming where students are at the most at risk for dropping out or being disengaged. So it is crucial that these are the schools that students and advisors focus on the most. Perhaps the logistics of some students who are interested in attending these meetings are not feasible for them, but there are ways around the barrier of distance. Even the most underfunded districts have some level of technology within the school, such as a computer lab or library where students that are interested could participate via conference call. Admittedly, a meeting where other students are together in person is much more engaging, but for students that are curious or want to contribute, setting up a structure of a meeting that accommodates students listening and providing time for questions and feedback could prove to be invaluable. In my tenure as a student representative, there were times where our executive committee could not meet in person, so I would hold meetings individually to talk about board matters and have an opportunity to answer questions and concerns. Though this was time-consuming, being able to address people independently is also critical to make sure that everyone has the same time and place to vocalize their concerns in an open and safe environment. Holding digital sessions either separately or in tandem with meetings allows students to be included. A point that I have yet to mention is students with physical disabilities. Meeting in person could be a challenge because some public transportation is not handicapped accessible, or it might be much more difficult to attend in person. But if a digital session was integrated with a physical meeting, then students could participate. Perhaps the last few solutions have been a little over-reliant on technology, but this shatters many potential barriers as long as the schools that students attend have some basic computer and internet access. Being able to create a site or a forum where students could type or vocalize their questions and input into an actual meeting being held would almost certainly increase the level of student voice dramatically. And I think it is a proverbial goldmine that no student organization has really tapped into, at least to my knowledge. Now, what do we do about the disproportionate level of students of color being suspended in relation to white students? This appears to be a very institutionalized issue, where I would imagine that this disparity varies widely depending on which school one is looking at. And I would also suspect that this has to do with the community itself. This becomes very complex because the issue may very well go beyond the control of the school, especially if the police are involved with a suspension or any disciplinary action. Now, in Massachusetts, I worked with other board members to vote to approve of new regulations that limit the use of both short-term and long-term suspensions. This law, 603 CMR 53, also ensures that the principal of the school has to notify both the students and the parents or guardians for the reason behind the potential suspension. And all parties have the chance to meet with the principal to discuss potential alternatives to suspension. Additionally, the law requires that the student will have access to their education during times of suspension to ensure that the student will not fall behind. The school also has to annually report all of their expulsions and suspensions to the state to investigate the potential of misconduct. Most importantly, the Commissioner of Education has the ability to investigate the data, and if they see any disparity between race, ethnicity, or gender, the commissioner then can have the school make a plan to avoid disparities from perpetuating. This is the kind of comprehensive law that will allow schools to be accountable for their disproportionate suspensions. I've also linked the law to my transcript for this episode for those who are interested in proposing similar regulations in their home state. My website is danbrogan-studentsasstakeholders.blogspot.com. Again, that is danbrogan-studentsasstakeholders.blogspot.com. As we near the end of our podcast, I'd like to summarize our key findings and solutions in this episode's Exit Slip. Conversations about marginalization and discrimination can be difficult, but are the most important conversations to have in policy. We cannot create beneficial policy without reaching out to students of all kinds, especially those who are at risk. When we are reaching out to students, consider who and why we are reaching out. We need to drop our assumptions about who would be interested in participating in student representation. We can overcome certain barriers as long as we acknowledge the prevalence of these barriers. This allows for conversation and change. Technology can bring people of all kinds closer together and provide an actual voice. As always, thank you so much for listening. I genuinely hope that you enjoyed this week's conversation. And more importantly, I hope this information was insightful and let us make positive change with these important conversations being had on this podcast and elsewhere. I'm your host, Daniel Brogan, wishing you the best.